In 2016, a theme park's most popular and safest looking ride became a scene of unparalleled horror in one of the worst accidents I've ever heard of.
There was a deadly accident on an amusement park water ride in Australia. 4 people were killed
when the popular water ride catastrophically malfunctioned.
The Thunder River Rapids ride was a thrilling and well-loved attraction suitable for guests aged only 2 years and above that ended its existence buried in concrete because of an accident that killed 4 guests and traumatized hundreds of people. In today's video, we're going to dive into the horrifying story of the 2016 Dreamworld disaster. The 15th of December 1981 was a very proud day for John Langhurst. A project that he had spent over 7 years and millions of dollars building had finally been completed and was even opened that day in a ceremony attended by the Premier of Queensland himself, which was where this project had been built, Queensland, Australia. Longhurst had finally fulfilled a dream of building his own theme park, having purchased 210 acres of land in Coomera, a town on the east coast of Australia. Longhurst spent a lot of money hiring designers who had helped build Disneyland and Walt Disney World, and he himself worked 12-hour days for over 2 years to excavate the Mississippi River, on which a paddle wheeler would travel ferrying guests around the park. So it really was a labour of love. And in December of 1981, the park opened with this and a few other attractions, including vintage cars, the Rocky Hollow log ride, the Dreamworld Express, an IMAX theatre, and a koala theatre. Over the next few years, Dreamworld saw great financial success and expanded to over 40 rides, becoming Australia's largest theme park, eventually being sold and then resold between different owners until it got acquired by an Australian company called Ardent Leisure. New themed areas such as the Blue Lagoon Water Park and Gold Rush Country were opened, the latter of which debuted in 1986 with the Eureka Mountain Mine and Thunder River Rapids rides, along with some snack and refreshment areas. This whole area of the park was rustically styled to look and feel as if you were in the gold prospecting era. The Thunder River Rapids opened in 1986 and very quickly became the park's most popular ride. During the holiday season, over 600 guests per hour would travel along a roughly 450-meter long twisting watercourse, complete with slower, calmer sections, some of which included splash zones to get guests covered in water, some indoor, darker tunnel sections, and whitewater turbulence, which was provided by submerged wooden logs. And the rafts would travel with a maximum speed of up to 28 miles per hour. Guests travelled in 6-person fiberglass circular rafts, and the whole ride would take about 4 minutes to complete. Most of the park's rides had been designed and installed by an internationally renowned company called Intamin. However, the river rapids were created in-house, taking inspiration from a successful Intamin ride called the Rapids Ride, and were installed by an independent company contracted by Dreamworld. This is pure conjecture on my part here, but I'd assume that doing so was cheaper than purchasing the same ride directly from Intamin. The river rapids were designed as a family-oriented ride, and anyone over the age of 2 could participate. Some footage has survived on the internet of the ride in action, and as far as you can see, it does seem like one of the safest rides you could possibly go on, which makes the story we're about to go into all the more horrifying. To understand the nature of the 2016 disaster, we have to answer the question, what was the fatal flaw? The watercourse passively moved rafts downstream by a gentle sloping downward gradient, which meant that at the end of the ride, those rafts had to be picked up and transported back to the top using a conveyor belt system. This highest point of the ride was an area called the station, which was a platform that the ride staff used to supervise loading and unloading. The ride ended with the rafts being plucked out of the water reservoir by a conveyor, which pulled rafts up using wooden slats. And of the ride's 4-minute run length, about 40 seconds was spent climbing the conveyor, before the guests would exit the ride at the unloading point shortly after summiting the conveyor system. The ride was constantly staffed by a minimum of 2 operators, but could be ran by up to 4 in peak times, and 2 large pumps continuously brought the reservoir water back up to the top, and this was necessary to maintain water level at the station and keep the ride flowing. These pumps would output over 4,000 litres of water every second, and the disaster that saw 4 people horrifically killed began with one of these 2 pumps. When the ride was initially built in 1986, the top station had a turntable that physically helped move rafts along to enable simultaneous load and unloading. However, the mechanism and bearings suffered from weathering and overall wear, and eventually the turntable was removed around 1990, and the rafts were instead just pushed along passively by water flow. A consequence of this decision was that when rafts arrived at the station, they would float around quite unstably as the weight of the passengers getting on and off shifted their balance. So to counteract this, Ardent Leisure added metal support railings to stabilize the rafts during this process. These were bolted onto the floor of the waterway and rose up about a meter or so from the floor of the trough, which was all well and good except for one very specific issue that unknowingly created a death trap. So the 2 pumps I mentioned earlier that bring water back up to the top, there was a very particular fault with one of the 2, the south pump. It tended to shut off intermittently and water would then flood back into the open mouth of the pump, falling back down into the reservoir. And when police later reviewed CCTV and conducted their investigation after the 2016 accident, they found that from the moment the pump was switched off, the water level at the station would drop by 20 centimeters in 15 seconds and over 40 centimeters in just a single minute. The result was those steel support beams would become exposed and would beach the rafts in place, and as the rafts weighed several hundred kilograms, they were not movable by staff by hand. They had to switch the south pump back on, and once water flooded back into the station, it would push them back along. Despite this critical flaw being known, there was nothing that really indicated a water drop to staff, aside from an informal scum mark on the wall of the ride, which had been left there from years of operation. A light did flash on the load operator's terminal to indicate a pump failure, the terminal being a very important piece of equipment that we're going to come back to shortly. But for now, know that there was no audible alarm to indicate the south pump's failure, and according to the police, you couldn't hear a difference in the pump's engine sound from where the ride operators were stationed. Considering that most of the time the 2 operators were very busy managing the guests and not watching for the potential of a light to appear on the control panel, it meant that the first obvious indication staff would get of a water drop was, quote, whether the rafts were bobbling around or they're not moving in the water, indicating they had already landed on the struts, and this was known to produce some quite challenging situations for the ride's operators. Previously, on January 18, 2001, a ride operator was conducting the standard pre-opening checks, which included turning on the pumps and cycling one empty raft completely. On this occasion, the operator had dispatched multiple rafts. 2 had returned to the station and then got beached near the conveyor exit in low water levels after the south pump failed very quickly that day, and when a 3rd raft travelled up the conveyor and struck the 2nd, it hit it with such a force that it flipped entirely, jamming all 3 rafts in place before the emergency stop button was hit. No passengers were involved, but the event highlighted a potential for very dangerous situations to occur if the rafts got beached. However, Ardent Leisure focused their investigation on the actions of the park employee, saying it was her fault essentially. They blamed her for starting the cycling procedure without a 2nd operator present, a condition of the ride's operation being that 2 staff members were needed at all times, and that she had dispatched the rafts too close together, neglecting to wait the standard 35 seconds of spacing, and finally that she was inattentive to the impending disaster by talking to some guests who were standing nearby waiting for the ride to open. Consequently, she was banished to the 7th circle of hell, the food and beverage division, where shortly after she resigned and left Dreamworld. A more alarming incident occurred in 2014 when a ride operator heard a backup compressor shut down, which was responsible for operating the pneumatic gates that would automatically space out the rafts as they left the station, followed by the sound of a low air alarm 10 minutes later. Hearing this, he stopped dispatching rafts and began the ride shutdown procedure, but mistakenly turned a water pump off before he had collected all the rafts. Due to the resulting lowered water level, a raft had gotten stuck on the rails just at the end of the conveyor. Noticing that a 2nd raft was climbing the conveyor and was about to hit it, the operator hit the stop button. The 2 rafts came into contact with each other and violently bumped for a few seconds as the conveyor forced them against each other before it finally halted, although no one was injured during this incident. This operator then violated procedure a 2nd time by turning the water pump back on in order to get those rafts moving along a bit. Because he had initially turned the water pump off, which was not part of the low air pressure procedure, and that action did somewhat what directly caused the incident, he was terminated from his employment at the park. Neither of these incidents caused any change to the underlying procedures or design of the ride, as Ardent Leisure really considered operator error to be the main and sole cause both times, claiming that neither situation would have occurred had the operators followed the correct stopping procedure. And consequently, at this point, it's probably a good time to talk about just how difficult the ride was to operate. This ride was considered by staff as one of the most stressful to get stationed on because of how many tasks had to be juggled in order to keep the river rapids running safely, including monitoring the pumps, ride CCTV, air pressures, and queue lines, while getting guests in and out of the rafts safely at the same time. At the top of the turntable, the two operators would stand with one positioned at the unloading area and the second at the load position, with access to the nearby operator's terminal, which was the single full control point available to the ride's operators. An important criticism that investigators leveled at Ardent Leisure after the 2016 accident was that despite independent recommendations to do so, a single master e-stop button was never implemented on this control panel. In order to shut down the ride in an emergency, the lead operator had to first press the emergency gate button, which closed the pneumatic barrier to prevent any more rafts from being dispatched onto the watercourse, then press the conveyor stop button. Thirdly, press the emergency pump stop button, which bizarrely would shut down only the north pump, and finally press the alarm button to call other supervising staff over. There was no single button that a staff member or guest could press to immediately cease all ride operation in the event of an emergency, which is how situations like that 2014 disaster could happen. If you missed part of the procedure or completed it in the wrong order, it could have unintended and dangerous consequences, such as stranding rafts. This was made worse by the fact the conveyor stop button on the main terminal was not an e-stop. In fact, it would take over 8 seconds for the conveyor to cease movement entirely after pressing stop, which meant that a raft could move around 25% of the total conveyor length before the conveyor stopped. However, over on the unload station, there was a single unlabeled e-stop button that could stop the conveyor's movement in only 2 seconds. Police uncovered an internal memo that stated this conveyor e-stop was only to be used in situations where the regular ride stop button was not accessible, and unwarranted use could result in disciplinary action. It's also worth noting that testing of the emergency stop buttons was not part of the daily pre-operational checks, and although junior ride staff were verbally trained in emergency stop procedure, they were not required to actually press the emergency stop buttons as part of their training or role-play incident management. As a brief aside on safety, there was also automatic shutdown features for the conveyor for if the chain broke or if rafts got stalled at the bottom of the conveyor, and rollback gates for preventing rafts from sliding back down. However, crucially, there was no automatic shutdown for the conveyor if a raft got stuck at or just after the top. And this unique combination of factors came together in a disastrous way on October 25th, 2016. Like any other morning, at 8 AM, park technicians inspected the River Rapids ride, reported no issues, and then signed off the ride to the operations staff. That day, the number 1 operator, which was park code for the most senior trained staff, was 38-year-old Peter, who had been working at Dreamworld for over 4 years, with 2 years experience operating the Thunder River Rapids, and he was joined by a number 2 operator, 21-year-old Courtney. This day was actually her first ever day being trained to operate the ride, and at 9:25 AM a trainer began instructing her on how to perform the number 2 operator role, which included explaining but not demonstrating how the ride is turned on and off. At 9:50 AM Peter began the startup procedure and performed the pre-opening operator tests before opening the ride to guests at 10:05 AM. At this point, Courtney had received about 40 minutes of training. Peter would stand at the loading station while Courtney and her trainer operated the unloading station, and the first few guests started traveling around the rapids. It was around this time that, according to the trainer's testimony, she pointed to the yellow conveyor e-stop box at the unload station, which at the time had Peter's drink bottle sitting on top of it, and stated that this was the emergency stop button for the conveyor, and that it could be used in situations such as if Peter fell into the water or if a guest had gotten out and was standing on the conveyor, with the added caveat, but don't worry about it, no one ever uses it. However, Courtney maintains none of this ever happened, and she had no idea about the e-stop button at all, a small detail that is about to become horrifically important. By 11:15, Courtney was deemed to have completed training and was allowed to go on break 15 minutes later, being relieved by another senior operator, Chloe. Chloe was at the main control panel when 35 minutes later she noticed the water level in the ride had dropped. She called over Peter, who was still in charge of the ride, who then noticed the south pump had failed entirely. He then switched off the ride and called a code 6 on the radio, which was code for a serious ride failure, and maintenance arrived shortly after. The actual electricians were busy with other electrical faults that day, so maintenance performed a quick reset before the remaining guests were evacuated. Police investigation revealed that, according to maintenance staff, the south pump had failed 5 times in the preceding week, each time being reset without further incident. At 12:21 p.m, the ride was reopened to the public, with the newly trained Courtney returning to operate the load station in place of Peter. Chloe took over as lead operator, standing at the unload station. At 1:09 p.m, Chloe looked over to the main operator panel and noticed that the south pump failure indicator light was flashing, so she swapped places with Courtney and then shut down the ride, calling a code 6 for the second time that day. At this point, according to the park's maintenance guidelines, the ride should have been permanently closed until senior maintenance supervisors had a chance to look into the fault in more detail. One of the maintenance responders more or less suggested this, however another incorrectly stated the ride has to break 3 times before escalating the matter to a superior. So at 1:25 p.m, the ride was reset and reopened to the public. Around this time, Peter also returned and took back control of the ride from Chloe, operating the load station, while our newly trained Courtney stood at and operated the unload station. At 2 p.m, he loaded raft 6 with 6 passengers, 3 adults and 3 children, one of whom was only a year old. A minute later, Peter would load raft 5 with another 6 passengers from 2 families. The first family had travelled from Canberra and consisted of Kate Goodchild with her husband Dave, along with their 3 children, and Kate's brother Luke Dorset, along with his partner Rusby Aragi. Kate, Luke and Rusby entered the raft with one of her children, Ebony, while her husband Dave remained at the station with their 2 other kids. The second family had travelled from Sydney and consisted of Cindy Lowe, her husband Matthew and their 2 children. The remaining 2 seats on the raft were taken by Cindy and her son Kieran, while the others waited. Both raft 6 and raft 5 following it were captured on CCTV navigating the course without difficulty, before raft 6 was picked up by the conveyor belt and deposited in the station trough at about 2:04 p.m. However, this is where everything went wrong. About 30 seconds earlier, CCTV captured the south pump failing and the water level rapidly dropped as it flooded back down into the reservoir. Courtney quickly noticed that raft 6 had become beached on the metal struts just after the exit of the conveyor belt. Knowing that this was a dangerous situation, she immediately alerted Peter, who started unloading the rafts he had been about to send into the waterway. However, as the 2 operators were distracted by this, raft 5 started ascending the conveyor belt. Courtney looked back at Peter from the unload station and saw him beginning to shut down the ride. She didn't really know what to do. At some point, she noticed his facial expression just completely dropped. Peter had looked over behind Courtney and saw raft 5 cresting the top of the conveyor and got a rush of adrenaline. In a panic, Peter smashed the conveyor stop at the control panel several times, but the conveyor just wouldn't stop. The rafts were about 5 to 10 meters apart at this point, and as the distance closed, Peter immediately called 222, the park's most serious emergency call, before pushing the ride's alarm to audibly alert nearby employees that he needed urgent help. Peter was froze, only able to stand watching helplessly as raft 5 was violently pushed by the conveyor belt straight into raft 6, before which both rafts pivoted upwards into the air. When the ride was initially built in 1986, the conveyor belt looked more like this, with many wooden slats making a continuous surface. However, they had become warped over time and became heavy when they got saturated with water, which caused them to break off and cause mechanical failure. So Dreamworld chose to remove 2 out of every 3 planks, which left large gaps in the conveyor. This meant that there was just enough space between the slats and the metal struts that had beached raft 6, so that as raft 5 was pushed up into the air, it was then pulled down by the conveyor and dragged into this narrow gap, which ripped the raft apart and horrifically started pulling the 6 guests down towards the conveyor mechanism. mechanism, as they were only held in place by Velcro straps. Some fell out and others were physically pulled down into the conveyor, and the result was the same. All died as a result of combined internal and external injuries from multiple compressive impacts. In other words, they were crushed in the machinery with no evidence of drowning. They died very quickly. Ebony and Kieran, the other child aboard Raft 5, were seated at the very top, which kept them away from the machinery, and they managed to cling onto their seats for long enough to be able to exit onto the concrete. In total, it had taken over 30 seconds for the conveyor to stop fully, counted from the moment Peter, the lead ride operator, had pressed the conveyor stop button on the main terminal. Tragically, neither he nor Courtney pressed the conveyor E-stop button mounted on the unloading station, which likely could have prevented the disaster from occurring, as if you remember back to earlier in the video, this E-stop was able to stop the conveyor in only 2 seconds. The resulting scene was horrific. It took over a day to extricate all 4 bodies from the machinery, and multiple first responders required counselling from post-traumatic stress disorder from just how difficult the ordeal was to handle. The following are anecdotal details from unverified comments I found in various places online, but it said that some of the first responders commented the worst part of the entire event was that the rescue attempt unfolded right in front of the remaining family members, who were standing behind a fence next to the ride, meaning the paramedics and firefighters had to listen to these people go through the worst moment of their entire lives. 1 or 2 of the first responders apparently were even left unable to work permanently following the accident, with the scene being described by one in a single ominous word: mincemeat. The Queensland Police Department concluded an investigation to the coroner, recommending that no charges be laid against any individual person, instead citing that the cause of the accident primarily was mechanical failure and insufficiently trained staff operating the ride. The coroner accepted this recommendation but would refer Dreamworld's parent company Ardent Leisure to the Queensland Office of Industrial Relations, where they were fined $3.6 million Australian dollars and then paid a settlement of $2.1 million to one of the families. The Thunder River Rapids were demolished in 2018 and buried entirely in concrete out of respect for the families, before in 2021 a new roller coaster called the Steel Taipan was built in its place, in slightly less respect for the families. And according to recent reports, Ardent Leisure has paid out another $5 million to families and first responders, with the total cost to the company being estimated to reach almost $20 million. Of every case I've researched and eventually made a video on, this one really sticks out to me as being particularly heinous. There's something about the mixture of water and machinery that I find uniquely horrifying. It truly is a horrendous disaster. This video was brought to you by the CX Productions Patreon, and if you enjoy any of my content and want to support more videos, then please consider joining there. And you can also join my community on Discord if you'd like to speak with me, ask questions, or become involved in seeing some of the behind the scenes making of these videos. Links to both are in the description. Make sure to like and subscribe before leaving, and have a great day everybody. This was CX Productions. Goodbye for now.